At March 1945, somewhere in the shattered remains of Nazi Germany, a prisoner of war processing center operates under dim electric lights. American intelligence officers move between rows of captured German soldiers, conducting routine interrogations. The war in Europe is entering its final brutal phase. Then something unusual happens. A Wehrmacht sergeant, mud-caked and exhausted, asks his interrogator a question that stops the routine cold. "Is it true," he asks in broken English, "that General Patton commands in this sector?" The American officer pauses, writes something down, moves to the next prisoner. Another German, same question, then another and another. By nightfall, the pattern is undeniable. These weren't random inquiries. German prisoners, men who had just been captured fighting desperately against American forces, weren't asking about their fate, about food, about medical treatment. They were asking about one man. George S. Patton, Jr. The intelligence reports made their way up the chain of command, crossing desks from battalion to division to corps headquarters. When they finally reached 3rd Army headquarters in Luxembourg, they landed on the desk of the most controversial, most feared, most effective American general in the European theater. What Patton said when he read those reports would reveal everything about the psychological warfare he'd been waging, the reputation he'd deliberately cultivated, and the terror he'd successfully planted in the German military mind. But it would also expose something darker, something about ego, about the thin line between confidence and arrogance, and about a man who had spent his entire life preparing for war, only to discover that his greatest enemy might not be the Germans at all. This is the story of a moment that never made it into the official histories. A moment that shows us who Patton really was when the cameras weren't rolling and the censors weren't watching. The official story of George Patton in 1945 is well documented. 3rd Army commander, liberator of Bostonia, the man who drove faster and hit harder than any other Allied general. The newspapers back home portrayed him as America's answer to Rommel, a warrior poet in a tank, driving the Germans back to Berlin with nothing but audacity and gasoline. But that's the sanitized version. The reality was far more complex, far more disturbing, and infinitely more human. By March 1945, Patton had become something unprecedented in modern warfare, a general whose personal reputation had become a weapon in itself. German soldiers didn't just fear the 3rd Army's tanks and artillery, they feared the man commanding them. Intelligence reports from captured German officers revealed that Wehrmacht briefings specifically warned troops about Patton's tactics, his speed, his unpredictability. Some German units had standing orders: if you encounter 3rd Army forces, assume Patton is planning an encirclement. Withdraw immediately. This wasn't accidental. Patton had spent years cultivating this mystique, this aura of invincibility, the ivory-handled revolvers, the perfectly tailored uniform, the profanity-laced speeches that soldiers repeated like scripture. Every element was calculated to create not just a commander but a legend. His staff officers knew the truth. Patton studied his image as carefully as he studied maps. He understood that in modern warfare, psychological impact could be as decisive as firepower. If German soldiers believed they were facing an unstoppable force, they would break faster, fight less effectively, surrender more readily. But there was a cost to this strategy that Patton either didn't see or didn't care about. By turning himself into a myth, he'd created something he couldn't fully control. The line between George Patton, the effective general, and George Patton, the theatrical persona, had blurred beyond recognition. His subordinates whispered about it. His superiors worried about it. Eisenhower, who had known Patton since their days together at West Point, watched with growing concern as his old friend disappeared deeper into the role he'd created. When those intelligence reports arrived at 3rd Army headquarters, describing German prisoners asking about Patton by name, they represented something unprecedented in military history. The enemy wasn't just defeated, they were psychologically dominated before the first shot was fired. This should have been a triumph. Instead, what happened next would reveal the dangerous instability lurking beneath Patton's carefully constructed exterior. To understand Patton's reaction, you have to understand the man behind the myth. George Smith Patton, Jr. was born into California aristocracy in 1885, raised on stories of his Confederate ancestors, fed a steady diet of military history from the moment he could read. His grandfather had been a Confederate colonel killed at the Third Battle of Winchester. His great-uncle had died at Gettysburg. Warrior blood, his family called it. Young George didn't just want to be a soldier, he wanted to be a conqueror. Alexander the Great, Napoleon, Caesar. These weren't historical figures to Patton. They were competitors across time, benchmarks against which he measured his own destiny. He genuinely believed in reincarnation. told anyone who would listen that he'd fought in past lives, as a Roman legionnaire, as a soldier with Alexander, as a cavalryman under Napoleon. This wasn't metaphor. Patton literally believed he was a warrior reborn through the centuries, destined for greatness. His colleagues at West Point thought he was eccentric. His subordinates in France during World War I thought he was brave to the point of insanity. During the Battle of San Miguel in 1918, then Colonel Patton led a tank assault on foot, walking ahead of his armored vehicles, firing his pistol at German positions like some anachronistic cavalry officer. He was shot, kept fighting, collapsed from blood loss. Received the Distinguished Service Cross. But the medal wasn't enough. The recognition wasn't enough. Nothing was ever enough because Patton was competing against legends who had conquered continents, and he'd merely taken a few miles of French countryside. This hunger, this desperate need for historical significance, had driven every decision he'd made since 1918. The theatrical uniform, the profane speeches, the calculated displays of ruthlessness. All of it designed to ensure that history would remember George S. Patton not as another competent general, but as one of the immortals. By 1945, at age 59, Patton knew time was running out. The war in Europe was ending. Once Germany surrendered, his opportunity for glory would evaporate. He'd be just another retired general, giving speeches at veterans' halls, fading into comfortable irrelevance. This terror of obscurity explains what happened when those intelligence reports reached his desk. German prisoners asking about him by name represented validation. Proof that he'd achieved what he'd spent his entire life pursuing, the ability to defeat enemies through reputation alone. But it also represented something more dangerous. It represented the moment when George Patton, the man, disappeared entirely, replaced by George Patton the legend. When he could no longer distinguish between the role he was playing and the person he actually was. The intelligence briefing took place at 9:30 a.m. on March 23, 1945 at 3rd Army Headquarters in Luxembourg. Present were Patton, his Chief of Staff Brigadier General Hobart Gay, his intelligence officer Colonel Oscar Koch, and several staff officers. Koch delivered the report matter-of-factly. Multiple prisoner interrogations across different sectors showing the same pattern. German soldiers asking about Patton specifically. Some inquiries bordered on the bizarre, prisoners asking if the stories were true, if Patton really wore ivory-handled pistols, if he really stood in his jeep during artillery barrages. The other officers in the room expected Patton to be pleased. This was, after all, evidence that his psychological warfare strategy had worked. The Germans feared him. Patton's initial reaction was silence. He sat at his desk, reading and rereading the intelligence summaries. The room grew uncomfortable. Staff officers exchanged glances. Gay shifted in his chair. Then Patton spoke. "They're asking if I'm here." "Yes, sir," Koch confirmed. Not asking about Third Army positions. Not asking about our strength or our plans, asking about me. "That's correct, General." Another long silence. Then Patton stood, walked to the map board covering one wall of his office. He stared at it, hands clasped behind his back, the posture he always adopted when he was thinking deeply. "Do you know what this means?" he asked, not turning around. The staff officers waited. "It means they're more afraid of the idea of me than they are of our actual capabilities. It means we've won the psychological war so completely that German soldiers are surrendering to a reputation." He turned back to face the room. "It also means," he continued, voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "that if I'm not here, if I'm not personally present, they might decide to fight harder. Because maybe the legend isn't real. Maybe Patton is just propaganda." Gay saw where this was going and tried to intervene. "Sir, with respect, that's not." "I need to be visible," Patton cut him off. "More visible. I need these German bastards to know that I'm not just here, I'm everywhere. Every kilometer we advance, they need to think I'm personally leading it." This wasn't strategy, this was obsession. Over the next week, Patton began appearing at frontline positions with increasing frequency. Not content with the usual general's inspection tour, he started showing up at active combat zones, standing exposed while German artillery rounds landed nearby, making sure his distinctive helmet and uniform were visible. His staff was terrified. Enemy snipers had standing orders to target American officers, and Patton was making himself the most obvious target possible. But when subordinates urged caution, Patton's response was always the same. "The Germans need to see me, they need to know I'm real." On March 28, during a visit to the 4th Armored Division near the Rhine, Patton's jeep came under mortar fire. His driver swerved, trying to reach cover. Patton ordered him to stop, stood up in the vehicle, waited until the barrage ended. Later, when a reporter asked him about the incident, Patton smiled. You think those German gunners didn't know who they were shooting at? Of course they did, and they missed, because they're afraid men shoot badly. But his officers noticed something troubling in Patton's eyes during these incidents. Not just confidence, something wilder, something uncontained. The breaking point came on April 4, 1945, at a prisoner processing center near Frankfurt. Patton arrived unannounced, as he often did, wanting to see how his army was handling the flood of German surrenders. By this point, Wehrmacht resistance was collapsing across the Third Army front. Whole battalions were surrendering without firing a shot. The camp commandant, a lieutenant colonel named Harrison, was surprised but prepared. He offered Patton a tour, showing him the efficient processing system, the medical treatment for wounded prisoners, the food distribution. Patton barely looked at any of it. I want to talk to them, he said. Oh, sir? The prisoners, I want to talk to German prisoners. Harrison hesitated. General, I'm not sure that's in order, colonels. So Harrison arranged it. Selected a group of recently captured German soldiers, mostly enlisted men, a few junior officers. Brought them to a separate area where Patton could observe them through a wire fence. What happened next, according to multiple witnesses, revealed everything about Patton's psychological state. He stood at the fence studying the prisoners. They stared back, recognition slowly dawning. Whispers spread through the group in German. One word repeated, Patton. Then Patton did something no one expected. He smiled. Not a warm smile, not a victor's magnanimous gesture, something else. Something performers do when they hear applause. Ask them, Patton said to the interpreter. Ask them if they know who I am. The interpreter, uncomfortable, translated. Several prisoners nodded. One older sergeant spoke up. The interpreter translated, Yes, General, we know you, everyone knows you. Ask them what they've heard about me. The next few minutes were surreal. German prisoners, through an interpreter, recited stories about Patton that sounded like folklore, that he never slept, that he could predict where attacks would come from, that his tanks moved faster than any German equipment, that entire German divisions had been ordered to retreat rather than face Third Army forces. Patton listened to all of it, his smile growing wider. Then he spoke directly to the prisoners in English, knowing most wouldn't understand but not caring. You're goddamn right, he said. Everything you heard is true. I'm faster, I'm meaner, and I'm better than any German general you've got. You should have surrendered weeks ago. Would have saved yourselves a lot of misery. The interpreter looked uncertain about whether to translate this. Patton noticed. Tell them exactly what I said. The interpreter complied. The prisoners' faces showed a mixture of emotions, defeat, yes, but also something else, almost relief. As if having surrendered to Patton specifically made their surrender more acceptable, less shameful. Patton turned to Harrison. Make sure word gets out. Make sure every prisoner who comes through here knows that Third Army is my army, that I'm personally directing every operation. I want that information to spread. Spread, sir, to whom? To the Germans still fighting, Colonel. I want every Wehrmacht soldier from here to Berlin to know that if they're facing Third Army, they're facing me, and they should surrender accordingly. Harrison realized what Patton was doing, using prisoners of war as propaganda vectors, deliberately spreading his own legend through enemy channels. It was brilliant. It was also ethically questionable. And it was completely, utterly Patton. The incident at the prison camp didn't remain secret for long. Military intelligence officers monitoring prisoner communications noticed an uptick in references to Patton among captured Germans. More significantly, interrogators reported that newly captured soldiers were increasingly mentioning Patton's personal presence as a factor in their decision to surrender. At Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, Eisenhower's staff took notice. On April 12, 1945, Eisenhower summoned Patton to SHAEF headquarters in Reims. The meeting was private, no staff officers present, no official record kept. But according to Eisenhower's personal aide, Commander Harry Butcher, the Supreme Commander's mood beforehand was somewhere between concerned and furious. What was said in that meeting has never been fully disclosed, but the effects were immediate. After returning to Luxembourg, Patton was noticeably subdued for several days. His frontline visits decreased in frequency. He stopped his practice of standing exposed during artillery barrages. To his staff he said only, Ike thinks I'm getting too much publicity, thinks it's bad for Allied unity. But privately in his diary, which Patton kept meticulously throughout the war, he wrote something more revealing. Ike doesn't understand that this war is about more than killing Germans. It's about creating legends that will prevent future wars. If the Germans fear us enough, fear me enough, maybe their grandchildren will think twice before trying this again. This entry reveals Patton's self-justification for his behavior. In his mind, he wasn't engaging in egotistical theatrics. He was conducting long-term strategic psychological warfare that would extend decades into the future. Whether this justification held any military validity is debatable. What's certain is that Patton believed it absolutely. Meanwhile, German military intelligence was indeed tracking the Patton phenomenon. Intercepted Wehrmacht communications from April 1945 showed desperate attempts to determine Patton's location at any given time. German commanders were diverting reconnaissance resources they desperately needed for actual defensive operations, just to track one American general's movements. From a purely tactical standpoint, Patton's strategy was working. But the cost was becoming increasingly clear to his superiors. Patton was no longer just commanding Third Army. He was becoming larger than Third Army, larger than the Allied command structure, increasingly difficult to control or predict. On April 30, 1945, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his Berlin bunker. 8 days later, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. And George Patton faced the terrifying reality he'd been avoiding: peacetime. In the months following VE Day, Patton's behavior became increasingly erratic. The warrior who'd spent 60 years preparing for combat suddenly had no war to fight. He was appointed military governor of Bavaria, a role requiring diplomacy, political nuance, and patience, 3 qualities Patton had never possessed and had no interest in developing. Within weeks, he'd created a controversy by suggesting that former low-level Nazi Party members should be retained in administrative positions because they were the only Germans with governmental experience. The statement caused a firestorm. Eisenhower, exhausted from managing his most talented but most difficult subordinate, finally took action. On October 7, 1945, Patton was relieved of command of Third Army. The official reason was administrative differences. The real reason was that the U.S. Army no longer knew what to do with George S. Patton in a world at peace. In his final weeks in Europe, Patton gave a series of speeches to departing soldiers. These addresses, delivered without the profanity and bombast that had characterized his wartime rhetoric, revealed something different: a man grappling with his own obsolescence. "You men are going home to be civilians again," he told one assembled group. "You're going back to your real lives, the lives you were meant to live." He paused, looking out at the sea of young faces. "I have no life to go back to. I was never anything but this." On December 9, 1945, George S. Patton was critically injured in a traffic accident near Mannheim, Germany. His neck was broken. He was paralyzed from the neck down. 12 days later, on December 21st, he died. The man who'd survived 2 world wars, who'd been shot and blown up and nearly killed a dozen times in combat, died from a car accident during peacetime. The irony wasn't lost on anyone who knew him. At his funeral, General Omar Bradley, Patton's former subordinate who had eventually outranked him, said something telling. "George was the most brilliant warrior I ever knew, but he was a warrior in an age that was learning to be uncomfortable with warriors." The story of what Patton said when he learned German prisoners were asking about him isn't really about those specific words. It's about what those words revealed. A man who'd built himself into a legend discovered that legends are prisons of their own making. Every day, Patton had to be more theatrical, more visible, more excessive, because that's what legends do. They don't get to have quiet moments. They don't get to be uncertain or afraid or simply human. The German prisoners asking about him by name wasn't just validation. It was confirmation that George Patton the person had successfully disappeared, replaced entirely by George Patton the character he'd invented. And he was trapped in that character until the day he died. There's a broader lesson here about leadership, about the dangers of becoming your own mythology. Effective leaders inspire through competence and character. Legendary leaders inspire through persona and spectacle. But spectacle requires constant maintenance, constant escalation, constant performance. Eventually, the performance becomes all-consuming. Patton once wrote in his diary, "I'd rather be a hero for 6 months than a nobody for 60 years. He got his wish. But in those final months of his life, lying paralyzed in a hospital bed, unable to perform, unable to maintain the legend, he was finally just George Patton. Not a warrior, not a general, not a mythological figure. Just a man who'd spent his entire life running from normalcy, only to discover in the end that normalcy was the one thing he'd never learned to face. The German prisoners who asked about him were asking about a ghost, something that seemed real but was ultimately just shadows and theater. Patton knew this, embraced this, and ultimately was destroyed by this. That's what he said, really, when those intelligence reports reached his desk. He said, "I've won." And he also said, "I've lost." Both were true. Both were always going to be true. That's the nature of legends. They outlive the people who create them, but the people who create them rarely survive the creation.